I'm Tyler, and this is the AntiSocial Network.
Don't look away. Let the fear wash over you.
Hey, T-Dog. What is up in his house?
Welcome to your number one source of internet oddities.
My life is a living hell.
There's just so much beauty in the world, you know?
Here we host conversations with interesting people across the internet.
The God you believe in is not only not good, that God made a world filled with liberals.
Here's the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
You haven't heard of them, but I have.
Perhaps I am cringe, but that makes me free.
Join us every Friday for discussions on culture, entertainment, politics, religion, and whatever happens to catch our fancy that week.
Hell is actually real, and Christianity was right all along. Sorry.
Oh.
The cities are decaying, destroyed by decades of leftist policies. Return to monkey.
You're probably thinking this is some pretty deep stuff, and you're right.
This week we are joined once again by Ethan McGuire, the writer of the Ed blog, and a recent freelancer with the Dispatch, and who just had his piece on the Northman published this past weekend. How's it going tonight?
It's going well. How are you, Tyler?
Good as can be expected. So, as anyone who's been a longitudinal fan of the AntiSocial Network knows, you and I have developed a seeming rapport about our inability to come to a consensus on medievalism on film, which continues to this very day with the newest entrance into that, or whatever you want to call it, the newest iteration of that, which is Robert Eggers' The Northman, which at the time of came probably about 2-3 weeks ago, depending on when this goes up. But we both seem to have liked it, maybe more than some people did. It's getting very weird reactions, but that's kind of to be expected, I guess, for a movie that's this. I wouldn't call it weird, but it's definitely different. But we also seem to agree and disagree in really weird places as usual. So as always, this creates an interesting impetus for the discussion to see where we do and do not agree, and see if we can talk any of this out instead of just screaming at each other over Twitter as we usually do. So,
in direct messages, of course.
Yes. We're not doing this like over Twitter. That's not. That'd be funny if we did, but neither of us are that dramatic. So I don't think that the threat of us just like outright screaming at each other is not likely. So.
Right, correct. Yeah. And it's funny because when it comes to anything that is modern or postmodern, I would say you and I usually agree. But it seems like the most we would disagree usually comes to pre-modern things, or rather people's interpretations of pre-modernism.
Yeah.
Would you say that's accurate?
That's probably a good way to put it. I mean, when it comes to medieval stuff in general, I'm definitely poisoned by the fact that I have a medievalist girlfriend, and she is an absolute militant about the betrayal of the Middle Ages as a time other than just bleak darkness and unhappiness. Like her favorite movie is A Knight's Tale. Like one of her favorite movies is A Knight's Tale.
I love that movie.
Which it's great, and the reason she loves it is that it's one of the few big medieval films that actually kind of portrays the Middle Ages with the attitude and kind of joy that she sees and the kind of thing that she's nostalgic for in that time period. And in my case, I have a higher tolerance for postmodernism than she does, but at the same time, but the movies that have come across my plate have all irked me in very strange ways. And maybe that's reflective of the fact that I've just become a grouch, because I seem to be giving a lot more negative reviews to things and being mean to a lot more things than usual lately. If you go back and see my reviews for Zack Snyder's Justice League and Avengers Infinity War and all the big films, I've been pretty consistently iffy about it. So I worry that I might just becoming a someone who's looking for problems in films at times. But at the same time, like when we discussed The Green Knight at length last year, and I don't want to relitigate that here because we already talked about it for an hour and a half with Hannah.
Right.
But
no need to do it.
Yeah. So when I came into that movie, my problem was just that this overwhelming sense that the movie was pranking me in some very specific way. That I was the more I thought about it, the more it made sense in the way you describe it. But just it something always just kind of felt off about it, and that continual sense of irking just bothered me. And as I saw it play out with other films, I just kind of felt like there was a consistent trend where, you know, the medieval era was just this punching bag that kind of had to be constantly put down and constantly disregarded as backwards and wrong and evil, and, you know, the ne plus ultra of organized religion sins upon the world. And you saw bits and pieces of that in Benedetta, which, you know, I don't know if you've seen Benedetta, but holy crap,
yes.
what the...
Yeah.
I mean, I won't say it's a bad movie, but it's one of the most exploitative things I've seen in a while in terms of just...
Well, it's Paul Verhoeven. So that's,
yeah,
you have to go in knowing what you're getting into, especially latter day Paul Verhoeven. But
and I like Paul Verhoeven. I think Elle was a good movie. I don't know if you saw Elle, but
I think I did. I think I've seen that. Yeah. I think I remember it. I would have to revisit it. It's been since it came out, at least.
Yeah, I mean, if you take all the lesbian porn out of Benedetta, it's perfectly. It's a, you know, it's a decent medieval film. If only just as a drama, but, you know, then it loses like all of its marketability, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's Paul Verhoeven. I mean, as far as Benedetta goes, in my review of the Northman that was published today, as we're recording this at the Dispatch, I put a sentence in there, kind of putting that one down a little bit too, criticizing it. But yeah, I can talk about that in a little bit.
Sure, but I guess we kind of need to talk a little bit about the filmography of Robert Eggers, because we have gone back and forth a lot on his filmography over the past couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't seem to agree at all, like, about the base state of his films and what kind of baggage he's taking into them. So I guess just to start out with, what do you think about all of the 3 films that he's released so far?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I said to you when we were talking about getting together and recording a conversation on this, that I'm not really interested in defending him necessarily, because I think that he has actually a lot of weaknesses as a filmmaker and a lot of ways that he needs to improve. Some of those are in the technical areas. Obviously, he is technically, a lot of the ways, as in technical aspects of filmmaking, he is really good at. But there is some visual flair that I think is lacking sometimes, that he makes up for with some elements of weirdness. I think that even though I do appreciate his extreme rigid adherence to historical accuracy as much as possible when it comes to how things are built, how things look, how people are dressed, etc., he has even admitted that is basically a crutch for him. And I think it limits his ability to imagine things a little bit. I would like to see him be a little bit more imaginative with his movies. His vision is definitely strong. He has definitely a strong voice. But for instance, in The Northman, one thing I would criticize is that even though the cinematography really puts you there, a lot of times the cinematography in his movies is very cold and detached, I would call it, even when it is a little bit crazy. So I would like to see him get a little bit more visually interesting, a little more colorful in his movies. So there are definitely some things that I don't really want to come in here and defend him, because you can go onto Film Twitter or anywhere else in the film blogosphere or whatever you want to go and find tons of examples on YouTube of people who just worship him. And I'm not interested in doing that, because that's pretty uninteresting overall to me. But I think the main thing that, and are you picking that up, by the way?
I hear like vague sounds in the background, but it's not.
Okay. Yeah, it's our baby crying, so she's fine.
Please ignore the baby.
She's fine though. But yeah, my wife is in there with her, just in case anybody was wondering. I don't want anyone to think I'm abandoning my child.
I went to the ear doctor last week, and I legitimately, as I was like walking around, like I got in and I just heard like a 5-year-old screaming at the top of his lungs. I'm like, that baby is being murdered in the next room, and it's at an ear doctor. Like, I don't know what they're doing to that baby, but it's like, you know, the worst experience of his life times infinity. It's just like he's in agony. They're shoving a thermometer in his ear, and he's just dying. So.
Yeah, it's sometimes the simplest things that they cry at the most too. But anyway, so I just kind of wanted to put that down because I'm not interested in coming on and defending him because plenty of people will, his films specifically. But what I do really appreciate specifically about his movies is his respect of trying to show history in its own context. He's said a lot in interviews recently about how he tries to not go into any movies with a message at all, and how he tries to just represent the mindscape, as he calls it, of that time. So I really respect that. And then there was a really interesting thing that he was talking about on the Mark Marone podcast, even though I don't really care for that podcast, but I listened to it because he was on it, where he was discussing how he's really interested in looking to pre-secular, pre-modern times as kind of his search for the sublime. And so anytime I see a filmmaker doing something like that in what I consider to be an interesting and intriguing way, which I think he is doing, I try to support that the best I can, because I think, that as many artists as we can get doing that should be, because that will make their art a lot more interesting and a lot, it won't necessarily cause more religious, but more spiritual honesty and exploration in films, I think would be a good thing. Then his movies specifically, The Witch I really enjoyed, and The Lighthouse I liked a little bit less. That one goes a little bit too weird at times and a little bit too incoherent at certain points. But then The Northman, I think I like the most of all of his movies so far. Even though I would say it might be, in certain technical aspects, the worst one he's made so far. Not the worst one, but like not as tight as the other two for sure. So I don't know if that kind of like answers your question in a scattered way, but that's basically how I feel about him.
Sure.
And the elements that I would want to defend of his filmmaking.
Sure, and I'll generally say I've loved or liked. I liked all three of his films. I wasn't terribly ensnared by The Witch when it first came out. Like that movie got hyped to oblivion. Like it was kind of
too hyped.
It was one of those like A24 movies that A24 kind of realized they had a little bit of marketability to it, so they ended up I don't know if it was A24 or one of the other ones, but they gave it a much larger promotion, and as a result it did pretty well at the box office. And it's a very interesting kind of depiction of 17th century Christianity set against the Puritan colonies. And I've maintained for a while now that the movie is a more authored than I think you would agree to it as being, where I think that the movie is, and on all the attempts to try to make an extremely realistic depiction of, 17th century English colonies, it's a movie where the ending kind of very clearly stakes its place in the ground in terms of what it's ultimately saying about these characters. You have a girl whose family is being harassed by a group of satanic witches, and they kidnap the daughter, and the family battens down the hatches and goes insane, and the dad becomes a tyrant, and bad things happen until the girl decides she wants to join the witch coven and strips off all her clothes and starts flying into the air, which I think is a very obvious metaphor for a kind of liberation. It's a very dark liberation. It's a very kind of satanic in its implications kind of liberation, but it matches a certain kind of modern thought that I think makes it clear what kind of, if you want to attribute an ideology to it, it's very clear what it is. I mean, the Church of Satan, which is there are multiple satanic organizations in the United States. It's a progressive atheist organization, basically, that exists to troll pro-life activists by trying to claim that abortion is a vital aspect of their rituals. So it basically just exists as an organization that's trying to take advantage of religious laws so that they can push progressive policies and politics. And they took to The Witch and basically said, this movie represents us. This movie is our philosophy. It's about the about like the way religion like harasses people under patriarchal norms and makes it impossible for women to live their truth. And I mean, that might be a loose reading, but the film producers didn't turn the endorsement down. They didn't just completely disregard it. Obviously, they wanted it for the shock value because this horror movie was endorsed by the Church of Satan, is the kind of thing that, you know, that's up there with like Your Mom Hates Dead Space 2 in the realm of like really cringe over the top advertising. But the alignment's there, and it's the kind of you know, it's the kind of thought that you get a lot in neo-pagan and Wiccan circles that says that, you know, true spirituality is naturalistic, true spirituality is being in tune with the earth, true spirituality is liberation and escaping from tyranny and, you know, being in touch with your inner self, which, you know, any Christian is going to look and say that's New Age gobbledygook, and it's completely, you know, empty, vapid, self-absorbed, modern, not useful for you in any sort of meaningful spiritual sense. And, you know, that continues to some degree in The Lighthouse, which is a movie I think you and I probably disagree about even more, which I fall back on to the Film Crit Hulk argument that it's a movie that's fundamentally about dynamics between people who are in different positions in power, where you have a character who is the boss and he is trying to basically lording his power over this person in very cruel ways, and it's finding all these complexities in their performance, and in you know, there's the undertones of like homoeroticism, and the finale, which is a direct appeal to Prometheus Bound, which is the famous Aeschylus play, which is about you know, the god that defies Zeus because he realizes that the god is wrong and he has to, you know, stand up against him to save mankind or start mankind anew by giving them the power of life. And that play famously was a favorite for Karl Marx. So, not to say that anyone who likes The Legend of Prometheus is a Marxist, or that making a movie about you know, the dynamics of power and subservience is innately a Marxist thing to do, or a, you know, homoerotic thing to do, or anything like that. But with both of these films, you sense where Eggers' priors come from, and obviously, like you said, you don't. Eggers has gone on the record saying that he doesn't approach these films with a strict agenda of something he wants to do. He just finds all these kind of things in the story. But the thing that I don't know if I agree with is the degree to which he's not, you know, at least authoring some of these, because it's not like I don't think he's crafting these stories the way that, you know, who's the guy who did Happy Go Lucky? I'm forgetting his name, but the guy who did, you know what I'm talking about, right?
I think so. Just a second. Go ahead and say what you're going to say about it.
Well, he's not I don't think he's the kind of director who writes his scripts in real time and develops them alongside the actors in the way that someone like the guy who did Happy Go Lucky.
Well, definitely not. No.
So
Mike Lee?
What's that?
Is that who you're talking about, Mike Lee?
Mike Lee, yeah. Mike Lee, when he directs a script, basically he writes the first draft of it, and then he takes it to the actors, and then him and all the actors will rewrite it together, basically based on their thoughts on the characters that he's written, and basically developing it into a deeper kind of performance-driven story. And I don't think that's what he did here. He's obviously going at these with scripts and stories in mind, with archetypes in mind, and assumptions in mind, and the tensions he's finding in these stories as he's executing them, they strike me of tensions that someone who's already progressive might intentionally or unintentionally bring into his story, in either in an authorial sense or in an unintentional sense. Because he talks about in that interview you told me about toxic masculinity and you know, oppression and all that stuff. And these ideas keep showing up in the movies in these very meager ways that make me think that they're supposed to be reframing the story in some regard. And specifically with the Northman, like 90% of this movie is just, you know, the prose edda, but played completely straight. Like that's what the movie feels like for the most part. But then we get to the midway point of the movie where spoilers, where you get the speech by his mother, and she says, I used to be a slave, and I had to claw my way up into, become a queen, because that's what the society is. We're a society of slavers, and we just live in this society where cycles of violence are just kind of things that happen, and your revenge doesn't mean anything, because it is, from my perspective, I was liberated, but in your perspective, you're just kind of following your cruel father's whims. So there's like all these assumptions of moral relativism and, toxic masculinity and oppression and, slavery. Like, these are like, all these progressive buzzwords like that just seem to be arising in this one scene, but don't really go on to affect the end of the movie. And it's very strange. Like I in my story that I'm working on for the New York Sun, I compared it to Hamlet, which is a apt comparison because this is based on the same legend that Hamlet is based off of. And I said, in Hamlet, this would be the moment where, this would be the kind of speech that causes Hamlet to have an absolute meltdown. Because that's just the kind of character Hamlet is, where, any amount of doubt will send him into a complete anxiety spiral for the next act. And but here, our lead character is not a terribly reflective person. He's determined to ride all the way to Valhalla on his revenge quest, and more or less he gets exactly what he wants as he wants it. And even though basically every female character says don't do it, you're doing this for no reason. So the degree to which his films are subversive is debatable, but there's all these little seeds in them that make me think that these movies are trying to undermine their narrative in some way, or they're trying to create a sense of like dark irony that your progressive viewers are supposed to catch, where it's like, oh, so that's what this movie's about. Like, this is like, I could see some progressive walk out of the Northman being like, this is a movie about what it happens when you don't listen to female leaders, or if or it's like, or in a more serious sense, you could say it's a movie about, not trusting your inner voice and letting and as presented by the female characters, who are more sensible and say like, hey, you should stop this stupid revenge quest and be a dad. Like, that's what the female love interest says very late in the movie. It's like, hey, you shouldn't go back and try to kill this guy for no reason in a way that will obviously get you killed and make me a single mom with no one to raise your sons. Like, you should stay with us. And like, I can imagine a progressive being like, oh, this guy's so toxic. Like, this guy is just like, he has been consumed by his male expectations in a society that's raised him up like this to want to march off to his death rather than be a dad. Like, he'd rather leave a bloody murder path than go to therapy, as the kids would say. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think, and it is that interpretation that you and I disagree on. And part of this, I think that the elements that you're finding that could even in certain cases be inconsistencies are not really a progressive mindset, but someone who is searching, as he talks about, searching for the sublime and the pre-modern, as he's put it, but he is not willing to commit. And that's actually one of the things that I would say is also kind of an artistic weakness of his, is his unwillingness to commit to a certain line of thought. He's been pretty clear about that in several recent interviews. So that is really how I see that, because I know that all three of these movies have been interpreted in the way you're talking about by various critics, especially progressive critics. But for instance, I think that each of them has several elements in the films that undermine that reading. So in The Witch, yes, there is that liberation, but it is a liberation to a coven of witches who not only kidnapped and murdered her baby sister, but also ground her into a pulp, which we see them doing at a distance on screen, and use that for their various, spells and magic. And the way I have always read that ending every time I've watched it is that she feels like it is a choice that she has no choice in, that she feels fated, because I think it is put alongside the Calvinism, the hyper Calvinism that her Puritan father and mother believe in, and that she is assumed to believe in too. It seems like throughout the whole movie that she believes in it as well, that they have actually been cast out of the already Puritan Calvinist settlement because they are so crazy and unwavering in their beliefs that the people in the actual Puritan settlement have actually cast them out, just like the Puritans were cast out of England in a similar way. So I see that as more of along those lines, where she feels like the choice has been made for her already, and it is not actually a liberating choice for her, because just the way, at least, that Anya Taylor-Joy plays that scene does not seem like she's experiencing any kind of real joy. And at the end, that what she's experiencing is hysteria, not anything to do with actual happiness with her fate. So that is why I don't read that particular ending that way. If it was more unclear that they had killed the baby and kidnapped and killed the baby in that movie, I would be a lot more receptive to that take, which you're definitely not the only person who's had. I mean, a lot of critics have kind of pointed that out as well.
I'm reminded of William Blake's take on Paradise Lost, where he said, you know, Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, which, you know, and anyone who would have read Paradise Lost in 1650, 200 years before the Romantics were a thing, would not have interpreted Paradise Lost as Satan is the good guy. Because culture changed, and because the Romantics made things more about the internal perspective, Lucifer became a hero to the Romantics specifically because of how deep his internal perspective was. And I think that's the same perspective we get out of the Satanists, where the Satanists will say, like, you know, you believe, you know, Satan is the bad guy, but we see him as a force of liberation. He's the ultimate rebel. He's the one fighting against injustice and patriarchy and, you know, the authoritarianism, or, you know, he's the resistance, as the kids would say. Like, he's everything that someone who is a progressive, you know, stands for in a secular sense, but kind of wrapped up in a religious symbol. When you're not religious, it's very easy to take that symbol and be like, that's our guy. Like, it's like, especially to annoy people you don't like.
I also question considerably how serious that the Satanists are. How, you know, and we know that's fair. Atheists. And I believe, you know, I see it more as either a troll or just really like overall silliness. So I believe that was all just used as a marketing tool. But I think that he does undermine his films a little bit, like I said, in his unwillingness to commit. So that's, like I said, that's really how I see that. And I think that his films would be benefited if he would commit to a certain line of thought. And also, you know, like you said, it can be read that way simply because of the age we live in. I think better filmmakers would understand that and present it differently. And I think because of how he's going about basically his search through storytelling, he's just trying to show it however he can. And you know, he comes, as he talks about in various interviews, from at least a slightly progressive, at least liberal family. So we know that those kind of philosophies would definitely be affecting him. But yeah, again, and that's not the only thing that I believe that undermines some of those takes in the movies. You know, I know that fewer people have made the kind of Marxist comparisons about The Lighthouse, but what is the name of the guy you sent me the article of?
Film Crit Hulk.
Yeah. So,
by the way, I forgot just how hard he went after Jordan Peterson, just offhandedly in that article.
Yeah, in one single sentence. That was so strange.
Yeah, he did. When he did his review of The Force Awakens, he accused Ronald Reagan of being a bloodthirsty racist for one sentence. Yeah. He's nuts.
And that's all just ridiculous to me, to a pretty big extent. So perhaps I ought to take it more seriously than I do. And then, I mean, anytime that Eggers has talked about those interpretations, he's always called them interpretations after the fact. And I think he's just unwilling to say they're wrong, which, you know, a lot of filmmakers are like that. and also I think that he doesn't have a clear perspective himself. So I think he's a little, to a certain extent, like, well, maybe that is what the movie means, but he's just not committing to that either. So I think that's part of it. In The Lighthouse, yes, there is that dynamic of the boss and the underling, but I believe that's undermined a little bit by the fact that their social class is pretty much the same. The social class of the two characters seems to me, at least the way I read it, to be basically the same. And in fact, Robert Pattinson's character, it's possible, comes from a higher social class than the Willem Dafoe's character, since sailors were very low class usually, unless they were higher ranking officers, from my understanding, and perhaps I'm wrong about that. And then the mythological elements are so non-specific. Obviously, there's the Prometheus allusion, especially at the end, but it's not specific enough, I don't think, to be anything other than somewhat influenced by that mythology.
Well, I think in The Lighthouse, the visions are supposed to weave into the narrative, essentially to serve as a metaphor for the main character's mental breakdown. Which if you want to do a anti-Marxist analysis of The Lighthouse, would actually be the best angle to hit it from. Basically saying that the main character is living a complete delusion, and he is destroying himself and everything around him in his attempt to overthrow the person that wants to hurt him.
Also, there's just an element of a lot of when I read that, when I watched The Lighthouse the first time, I just instantly thought of a lot of short stories by people like Stephen Crane, Herman Melville, people like that, about the sea. And I saw a lot of those elements there. Then a extra layer of weirdness, mythology, and some modern things that some of those writers wouldn't have even dared put in their published works as well. Some of the more sexual elements of it. But there's also, I think, the really strong element that you see in a lot of those short stories from that period that he's drawing from, about guilt and being overcome by guilt, because we learned that Robert Pattinson's character probably killed somebody and is running away from that. So to me, that undermines part of the reason he goes insane is that overwhelming sense of guilt that he can't continue to escape, especially as his state of mind phrase. I think that wouldn't have been included if he were trying to make a more Marxist kind of analogy or their allegory.
At that point, it becomes like a damnation story about someone who's trying to escape his fate without, seeking help, and he kills his moral judge only for like this supernatural force to burn his soul and cast him down to the rocks. So exactly.
I believe that the one common thread through all three of the movies he's made so far, and we'll see, like how he continues into the future, is faith. That is one thing that he seems to believe in. Even though he can't seem to believe in anything else yet, he does seem to believe in fate of some form. Because the way I read the ending of The Witch, like I said, has to do with she feels like fate has led her to this point, or predetermination has led her to this point. And then in The Lighthouse, it's a guilt that he cannot escape. Fate brings it back to him and gives him the damnation that he deserves. And then, of course, with the Northman, fate, since the Vikings and the Icelandic people and all that whole culture believes so strongly in fate, and the Nords and all of the gods weaving the fates together, which a lot of European pagans believed in, and that continued and kind of became woven into even the Catholicism, especially once they were converted. That's one single thing, at least, that is a common through line through those movies, I think. So that's kind of how I read that more. It's along the lines of fate, which is a lot less specific. But again, another element of his kind of non-committedness. That's how I see it.
Well, I'm reminded of all things. I'm reminded somewhat of the way Ben Shapiro talks about The Simpsons. If I don't know if you've read his book Primetime Propaganda, but he talks about the The Simpsons in what he calls the kind of nihilist progressivism, which is basically the world would be moving in a much better place if people weren't just awful, which Shapiro thinks is the message of The Simpsons, which is not terribly off reading. It's I mean the point of The Simpsons is like this world is being held back by people just being awful to each other and just being rude and not listening and not falling and the world's just being insanely corrupt. So it's kind of this kind of weird progressive twist on the fallen state of humanity, and you kind of see that a little in the podcast that you sent me, where he talks about the factors like you look at these societies from 2,000 years ago, and
nothing has changed, is what he's saying.
We're still patriarchal. We're still warring with each other. Like human nature hasn't changed. And the only thing that keeps you going is the hope that there's something better, but it's not, you kind of have so he kind of has that contradiction in his heart where he wants a better world.
There is a little bit of nihilism.
Yeah, it's a kind of...
He doesn't believe that it's possible.
Yeah, well, he hopes it's possible. Like there's that spark in him. The nihilism doesn't seem to creep at him enough that he can't get out of bed every day. He's driven. He wants to explore people through art and to find a better world, but he doesn't seem to have hope for it, and I guess that bleeds into his work. Like maybe that's part of the reason why The Lighthouse has the ending it does, where you have the character who wants to destroy his oppressor and to contain the power of God within himself, contain this very ephemeral kind of strange knowledge that the Lighthouse seems to confer to people that are in the position of power, and he tries to take it, and it literally burns his soul, and just it almost literally destroys the film. Like you're watching it, like there's distortion in the film. Like this power is so powerful that the camera and the audio itself can't contain it. Like, and it throws him down a stairwell, and it literally ends on the famous image of Prometheus against the rocks with his gut being perforated by a bird. So,
and that's where I come in, and that's where my reading of the Northman starts. So I went into the Northman thinking about all these things, and that definitely affected how then I viewed it. So in it, and I want to come to your part about Kidman's speech through there, which is a lot of people have pointed out. Some people have said that she doesn't do a good job in the movie, but I think that scene proves that to be incorrect. She does a great job in it, I think. And part of that is that when I was talking about in The Lighthouse and The Witch, I believe that there are elements of the movie that undermine that kind of subversion. So it's almost like it's going to be subverted, and then it can't really be because of certain elements in the film. And that's how I see that, because obviously, she has that speech saying that she was a slave who he took, which was very common at that time. And, but she says things that we know as the audience can't really be true. Like she says that he was a coward, for instance, and that all he loved were, well, what does she say? And then rooting his horse, I think is how she puts it, rutting his horse. But we don't know for sure about the horse part. That could be very correct. But we know that he can't be a coward, or we at least feel as we're watching it that can't be true. That the War Raven, Arvindil, I think that's how you say his name. Because in the opening of the movie, he has a possibly mortal wound. And we imagine that could not have been got anyway except through battle. If he had been a coward staying behind the scenes while his men go and pillage villages and do the warring and all that, then how would he have received that? I mean, we have to assume that is directly through battle that he received that great scar. Or that great wound. It's not a scar, it's still bleeding essentially while he's there. And then also we know that he did feel a sense of familial loyalty, because when he realizes that there is a possibility that he could die, and we also can assume that possibly he feels that there are other things going on in his court essentially, his first instinct is, before he even goes to bed with his wife or any of those things, which she tries to convince him to do, he wants to initiate his son into the throne. He wants to get go through that. I forget the name of. I'm not steeped enough in Norse history.
Don't worry about the Norse names here. No one can pronounce them anyway.
And so his first instinct, as soon as possible, is to get his son, even though he's a little bit too young, and to take him and to get him into that ritual to where he can access the spiritual world and have that relationship with the Viking tree of life and the animal spirits and his spirit, and have access to the gods and access to fate. So we as an audience, we can't assume that if he were cowardly and the only things he cared about were treasure and women, that he would make those kind of decisions. Then also there's the element of the fact that all throughout that scene, Nicole Kidman's character, Queen Gudrun, is, well, she's not a queen at that time, keeps cycling through basically different ways of trying to convince Amleth not to, she trying to basically to get him out of his mission, to redirect him away from his mission. The first thing she tries is appealing to his love for his family. And then, so she kind of cycles through different ways of acting toward him. And even, of course, in the scene that my entire theater was like yelling and groaning at, where she tries to essentially seduce him, which is, of course, a Freudian. and that I have to believe is probably at least modernist in the Freudian sense. But she tries to essentially seduce him, which he then, especially when she tries to grab his sword and kill him. And so we know that she is not being entirely honest all throughout that scene anyway. And then also she talks about how good of a man Fjolnir is to her. Like, the reason she wanted Fjolnir to kill the king is because he loved her, she says. And he very, very well may love her, but he does not show any of that love that we see in the movie at all. And the only thing that we do see him portraying any kind of proclivity for sexually is trying to rape a slave, essentially, which he is only stopped by her cunning and ability to put him off in that instance. So we know that there are things that we are seeing throughout the movie that at least cast a pretty big shadow of a doubt on the way she is trying to portray the relationships that have happened thus far. And so that's why in my review of it, I put in as spoiler-free a way as I could that he has to guard himself against rewritten history.
That's I don't think that's incorrect, but I don't think the film dramatizes an unreliable narrator enough for that to completely justify that read. Like, when I think of, like, the way The Last Jedi or The Last Duel, dramatizes the unreliability of two characters to reconcile something that a mutual event that happened between them. It's part of the narrative in a clear way, and in this case, for the Northman, it's the narrative trying to slow the main character down, but not
I read it.
Not to subvert it. It subverts it thematically, but to the degree that it does, it's irony more than anything else. Because it's clear that the degree to which, our hero Amleth takes that word seriously is none at all. Like, if
he doesn't take it seriously at all.
Yeah, he doesn't regard it as important.
He is taken aback by it, but as soon as she tries to murder him in turn, he rejects it completely.
Yeah, like he does not stop his revenge quest. This movie is about him fully delivering on the catharsis he wants, even though he knows that he'll die. He knows there's no way to come back from that point. It's kind of got that,
at the end,
it's got that fatalist nihilism to it, where this character, all he wants in the world is to die doing the thing that he was made to do all those years ago, and he's willing to do it.
He was fated to do.
Yeah,
and I have a comment on that as well. But my thing is that, yes, you're right that the movie doesn't set up an unreliable narrator, but it's focuses specifically on the great wound that King Arvindil has. That is the movie definitely puts that in your face in a pretty gory way. And then it also bears out the scene where Fjolnir tries to rape Olga, Anya Taylor-Joy's character. Yeah. Those two things are very prominent. I mean, in a movie that is, to me, moved pretty fast. I know a lot of people found some parts of it to be really slow. That tries to push a lot of imagery and different plot and spiritual elements into the film. It does spend time to try to establish those two facts. And
I will say I
just feel like that has to have a bearing on how you interpret that scene, because both of those things have already happened when Queen Gudrun gives that speech.
I don't think that's a terrible read. I mean, I shouldn't say terrible. But one of the film critics from the Nashville scene down here, when he was at the theater with me, he gave a comment to the woman at the screening, basically saying that he thought that the attempt to do that was a half measure, that he didn't think that the film fully delivered upon the ideas it was trying to set up in that scene. So I could definitely see
which
that.
Scene?
If from a progressive subversion standpoint, I could definitely see this film is not, taking the story far enough to actually be subversive as a critique.
Correct.
Which
if he was trying to do that, then he did a bad job, which is possible, of course.
Yeah, it would have needed it probably needed a more overtly ironic ending, Yeah,
and that's the thing. Some people have called the ending ironic, and some people have said, have questioned to what extent he is actually experiencing these things. But I believe we're intended to see every religious aspect as pretty much, for the most part, factual. Because we literally see too many things happen in the movie for it to be ironic or for it to be only happening in the character's imagination. For instance, the ravens, Odin literally appearing for a split second in the frame behind. It's when he's captured and he's beaten. Then I believe, I don't know, I thought that was supposed to be Odin, but one of his many forms.
The raven is a symbol of Odin, so yes, that would have been
Correct.
Odin.
And his father as well, the war raven, Arvindil. So those two, because of course Arvindil worships Odin. So Odin appears in the frame for just a split second. You see him there in one of his forms. That's how I interpret that anyway. And then the ravens, many ravens literally enter the barn and peck him free. And then, you could even imagine, he just fell from there and the ravens were in his imagination. But then the characters, as they're entering the barn, as they open it, react to the ravens coming out. So we are meant to believe, I think, that those things are physically real.
There's also the sword.
I don't think that any of the spiritual elements are. There's a sword, of course, which he cannot draw except for.
And he gets it on an I don't remember if they explain it, but it's like a mummy ship that's just sitting in the middle of Iceland.
Yeah, it's a tomb. And some people have pointed to that because after he goes through this whole fight, then you see the camera pan and then he just takes the sword. So some people have pointed to that. Well, he's actually expecting us to believe that these things are just happening in the characters. The spiritual elements are just happening in the characters' imaginations. But that, from what I understand, is actually a pretty common trope. And, I'm sure that someone who actually knows more about these things could correct me. But from what I understand, it's a trope to where there is kind of a battle that happens in more of a spiritual dimension rather than the physical dimension, which also we see when Hymir talks to him through the basically mummified skull. Because Hymir's lips do not literally move. And so then you could read that possibly as well. That's all just in the imagination as well. You could put some of the things down to drugs. But then they're the elements of the sword existing, the sword having magical properties that we actually experience through the film. The snake that he reacts to then being a rope, which he actually physically uses to get in and out, things like that. I just think there are too many elements that we see for any of that to be ironic or imagined. I don't know what your take was on that.
It's really hard to tell. You can kind of see an argument for both ways. Where, on one hand, this movie, it like I said, it feels like a story that someone ripped out of the Prozetta. It feels like someone just took the script of a Norse, warrior tale, like one of the Icelandic sagas, and they just
it's from the I believe the most reliable source we have is from the Saxo Grammaticus, the Gesta Danorum.
Okay, for some reason I'd heard Pros Edda when I was researching.
Well, that has a lot of the information, and if I'm not mistaken, from my memory of some of the Eddas, I think that there are quotes from it in the movie, especially I think Hymir. I think some of the things that he says throughout the film are quotes from.
Well, it's a weird coupling because the subversive elements are there, but they're not impacting the narrative, and the sincere elements are there, but they're not forcing themselves in a way that feels like it's obvious that it's the way. So it's kind of it's like a movie where the subversion and the unironic are just in like inconsistent dialogue with each other. Maybe that's why the reaction to this film has been so bizarre, because I've seen the audience score is really low on this film.
It's not as low as some of the other art films though.
No,
surprisingly.
No. Although I am seeing, I'm already seeing the audience score is lower, therefore it's bad. Like the worst, my least favorite film discourse ever is back again.
Yeah, it's a reaction, but that is a reaction though to critics basically saying the opposite.
If I could kill any reaction on the internet, it's the high critic score, low critic score debate, because
it's silliness.
I hate it.
Yeah. Funny enough, I mean the Rotten Tomatoes viewer score is low, and I was actually talking to someone about that earlier on Twitter. But the fact is, it's higher than a lot of these this is obviously Focus Features, but it bears similarity to a lot of the A24 films, and obviously Eggers' last two films were A24 films. A lot of those will have like 40-50% negative, but if you look at the Rotten Tomatoes score, it's 66%, with the average rating that audience given it being a 7 out of 10, somewhere around there. So it's not extremely negative, and surprisingly, I saw it in a really good audience. Funny enough, because I know that some general audiences have not reacted well to it. But I saw it actually in a packed theater, which I was really surprised and happy at. And everyone reacted to it exactly like I think the director would want them to. And I didn't hear necessarily a lot of booing or anything like that. And I do not live in a particularly progressive area. So I was surprised and happy to see that.
The reactions are really all over the place. Like, I remember there's the really famous quote that Eggers said, where one of his test screening audiences said you need a PhD in Viking history to understand it, which that is a bizarre quote. Like,
I don't know.
I thought it was really easy to understand. Like, maybe I'm a pretentious idiot, and I just understand this stuff because I know But I'm like, okay, I've seen the Thor movies.
Yeah. Well,
I've read Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. I know enough about this to comprehend it. So
there are a lot of elements that are unexplained. Like, any of the spiritual rituals are not explained. The fact that he is essentially, for instance, fighting the basically zombie guy in a spiritual dimension rather than physical is not explained. Things like that.
Do you really need like a zombie explained to you in a movie?
No. But like, I think that's kind of like what they were pointing.
Like, that's like so. If you've played Skyrim, you understand that. Like, it's like, oh, it's a zombie guy. I got to kill the zombie guy to get the sword.
Yeah, I mean, I think the test screening thing is a little bit silly, and I don't really know how much to trust that.
Like, if I would say of the three Eggers films, I'd say this is the most easy to comprehend, at least
definitely.
For me.
And I think that's why the audience scores and reactions are a little bit better, at least, than his last two.
You were saying?
About the audience score?
You had a point I interrupted you on. Sorry.
Oh, I think I was just talking about how we're supposed to interpret the spiritual elements. But I did want to move on also to the elements of fate. And this is for the first time in his movies. I don't know how seriously to take this, but all of the marketing has the phrase "conquer your fate" in it, right? Now, I don't know if Eggers had any say in that, but it's really interesting because at the end of the film, he is not able to escape fate, but Olga, the Anya Taylor-Joy character, all throughout the movie, has talked about how her fate is intertwined with his. And he realizes, essentially, the way I interpret it at the end, that the way for him to overcome, in any small way at least, the situation that he is in, is essentially to combine their fates and he believes once he has a vision, once he touches the scar on her neck, that the only way to allow the next generation to survive, and because they're going to go to his family across the sea, wherever that is, the only way he can do that is to face back up to his fate, and the combination of the two people, the fates that they both have intertwined, will then allow essentially the conquering of that fate. And when you take into the fact that they've allowed the marketing to kind of focus around that, I do think it's we're meant to take that at face value as well.
Maybe, but Fjolnir's entire kind of deal is that he's a king in exile. Like I seem to recall that, you know, Iceland was one of those places where, you know, the Vikings became famous for exploring before Christopher Columbus. So I could be wrong. Maybe that's like farther south than like Newfoundland, but like the fact that he was chased all the way to Iceland and was essentially a barren wasteland.
Northern Iceland. Because in the beginning of the movie, his kingdom is in southern Iceland.
Is it? Is it on the same island?
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe so. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, part of the point of that little colony he's built there was that he is in exile. Like he doesn't have his kingdom
into
anymore.
Northern Ireland. Yep.
So he's
go ahead and make your point. I'll fact check myself real quick.
Like if the opening of the movie was set in Iceland, I didn't catch that. But the whole point of where he was that essentially he had been.
It was exile. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. He was exiled to basically like the wastelands because he had his kingdom was destroyed by another kingdom, and all of his villagers were taken as slaves, and which seems to be kind of the base state of humanity in this universe, where, you know, everyone is just being conquered by everyone else all the time, and your kingdom is kind of a really fluid thing that can change on a day-to-day basis. But I don't think he would have had the power to seek vengeance against Amleth.
Well,
he's too kind of busy kind of building his new life in exile, and, you know, with his wife and his new kids, and, you know, he's busy chasing off the weird spirits that kind of want to like sacrifice all of his virgins. So,
well, the one thing that is not explained in the movie is that it would have been culturally. I mean, he would, if he had not sought revenge on Amleth after everything that had taken place, he would have become even more an outcast than he already was, because it was a very litigious culture, especially in the early Viking age, to where you were socially expected to go take revenge. That was part of your vow to your family, essentially. So I think that is really what was being referenced there, but again, not explained. So, right, that's the reason I read it that way. But because it's not in the text, as you might say,
I mean, by the time that Amleth actually like introduces himself to his mother, it seems like no one really cares about him anymore. Like, he's like, "Oh, you've been gone for 20 years."
Oh, Amleth. Yeah.
It's like he's been gone for 20 years. They don't know where he is. As far as he knows, he's been dead. Like, up until that point, other than the ending where you might be able to say, "Oh, well, he just killed half their family, and now it's possible Fjolnir might chase him down for revenge," but it's not clear. Yeah. It's not clear if he has the resources to do that, but it's possible he could.
That's true.
But we also don't get a ton of character development for Fjolnir, so it's kind of hard to say for sure what his actual his motivation is, because it seems like for the duration of the film he's just kind of contented with his little colony, like, you know, living the frontiers of life. But
he's definitely been manipulated by Gudrun is definitely the impression that I got from it. Yeah, she essentially, it seems, if her story is correct, that she essentially manipulated him into the coup that he carried out.
Yeah, which is, I don't remember. Was that the deal with that wasn't the deal with Hamlet too, right? Because in Hamlet, the uncle has a little more agency.
Yeah, he definitely does. That's correct. Yeah, he definitely does.
Yeah, so there's definitely a different level, a different approach to that. So,
The characters in Hamlet definitely have a lot more agency.
Oh yeah. Well, that's something I wrote about in my
characters in the Northman.
That's something I wrote about in my submission to the New York Sun, which hopefully by the time this is up, it'll be up by then, or it'll be at a different website. I don't know yet. But what I close that piece basically by saying, like, well, the whole piece is comparing the fact that this movie is doing a little bit less ironic than the other medieval films, because the other medieval films are all about, they're all about how Christianity is bad, and Christianity is sexist, and Christianity is capitalist and evil, and all the bad buzzwords that people love. But this one isn't, because the movie is not Christian. It's pagan. It's Norse. And Norse and pagan mythology nowadays is all the rage in both a cultural sense and a religious sense. I mean, Wiccan is one of the most fastest growing religions in the world in the United States at the moment, because people want spirituality without actual ethics tied to it. They want, as Jonah Goldberg says in Tyranny of Cliches, they want a religion where it's not against the rules to have a three-way with your Pilates instructor. It's
very self-serving.
People want a self-serving religion, and I close the piece by basically saying, like, the movie loses something in that Hamlet has, because Hamlet, in being given the exact same quest that Hamlet is given, Hamlet is struggled with it, because he has to see this revenge quest through the lens of Christianity and through the lens of storytelling and everything and all the different kind of lenses that he puts on as Hamlet. Hamlet is the crazy version of Hamlet that he pretends to be. Hamlet is the character of a play. Hamlet is a Greek hero trapped in a Christian story. He's all these things at once, and he has to figure out a way to kill his uncle in a way that won't damn his soul, because he knows that vengeance and murder in his religion are bad things, and he's driven mad by that fact, and he's struggles with the reality of, how do you live out this thing when a supernatural force gives you clear direction, but that force seems to be at odds with your own religious culture and your beliefs and your own temptations as someone who wants, because obviously Hamlet is a suicidal, wimpy, neurotic, teenager who wants to kill others than himself, but he can't do that in his culture. So you lose the benefit of a character with that much introspection by the fact that, you stick Amleth in Hamlet, and Amleth is going to just straight up murder his uncle. You stick Hamlet in the Northman, and the plot never ends, because there's no way that Hamlet can navigate this world. Well, and the fact is that that Christianity creates moral obligations by the fact that it's there. And as a result, a movie like The Northman, it feels clean and unburdened and sharp, because it's a pre-Christian story being told in a post-Christian world where those two things have a lot in common to do with each other. Like, it's so unburdened by the realities of a world where you actually are, have to worry about the weight of your soul. And in Amleth's world, his only moral obligation is to seek glory and to fulfill his vengeance. Those are his obligations.
Yes.
And those are not the obligations of the Christian world.
Correct. And a few things I'll say about that. Number one, I do like that toward the end of The Northman, in addition to that, he adds the fact of essentially pairing his fate with Olga's and paving the way for another generation, which is made clear in the final moments of the film as well. So there is that element, make it slightly better, but obviously Hamlet is a much better work of art. Shakespeare is obviously
the hottest take tonight, guys. Robert Eggers is not Shakespeare. But...
Shakespeare is obviously the superior, but there is an element of Shakespeare that he was writing in a Christian age, a very well-established Christian age in England, and essentially the elements of paganism were still persisting. Like the ideas of fate and things like that, the supernatural ghost and all that. Were still persisting in culture, especially as far as I understand, the lower classes especially, but even up into the upper classes as well. I mean, Shakespeare's plays were obviously a lot of times most viewed by the lower class people, but obviously about a higher class royalty family. So he's dealing with the fusion of paganism and Christianity, and how those two things are a lot like oil and water in certain ways. But for a Christian age where people will understand that, I think part of the value that I see in the Eggers like translation or adaptation of that story that influenced Hamlet, at least obviously heavily influenced it, is that we are living in that kind of post-Christian world, and anyone who is looking to a pre-modern age, I want to encourage that for sure, because as you and I were kind of talking, as C.S. Lewis often said, and even bore out through a lot of his writing, he believed that the pagan pre-modern world was far superior to the kind of post-Christian world that he saw coming, the secular world, devoid of even the things that the pagans had. Because I think Lewis would have seen the Norse and the Greeks and people like that as believing in, I think, what he would have probably called the good gods rather than the satanic ones. And so that is what I want to encourage specifically. Obviously, like you said, not as complex, not as thoughtful as Hamlet and Shakespeare, but worthy of consideration at least, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I go back and forth with a lot of my Catholic friends who are very, very harsh on art, which is that, you know, the benefit of postmodern art is that it has this ability to dig under the surface of a thing and to find the tensions in it and to find, you know, to dig into a person's instincts, which is a lot more than I can say for most art nowadays.
Correct.
Like that's generally the reason why I tend to engage with it at all, or even more than stuff. Like, this is the reason why we did an hour and a half on the Green Knight and an hour on the Northman now. Even
well, the Green Knight,
because it's because they're both, you know, they're art we can actually debate. There's art with implications and characters, and
well,
you don't know how many
modern world.
You don't know how many pieces of art I can't say don't have actual characters in them.
Well, they're both the Green Knight and the Northman are considering the pre-modern world in very different ways. I think that the Green Knight is perhaps more thoughtful about the pre-modern world, or which would of course be the Christian and pagan world of the King Arthur's court. But I think the Green Knight is also still a postmodern work of art, in that it is essentially taking a millennial or Gen Z character and plopping it into a mutated version of the Christian pagan world.
Yeah, so it's kind of it's a fascinating wave almost. It's like we're, you know, I'm reading Tom Holland's Dominion at the moment, and he separates the book into the history of Christianity into three phases, which is Antiquitas, Christendom, and Modernas, which, you know, when in some ways I think, you know, the Northmen and the Green Knight they're almost a vanguard of that, you know, of Modernas, which is, you know, the dialogue that we saw between the pagan world and the Christian world at one point being reflected on by the post-Christian world. And
correct.
The result is we're seeing the same stories in all three of these times played out completely differently into different facts, and it tells us a lot.
The reason I'm so interested in pieces of art like the Green Knight and the Northman is because I believe that at this point we have to stop, as Christians, we have to stop worrying about the fact that Enlightenment knowledge is being thrown out the window in a lot of instances. We have to face up to the fact of the world that we exist in. And, you know, God put us in this timeline. he made us for this time. And so we have to figure out a way forward, a way of engaging our culture. Because although I love in art, especially nowadays, to prioritize the masters, you know, and to read the great poetry and epic poetry and all those kind of things, in order for us to affect culture at all, we have to interact with it right now. And I think it is good for us, at least in certain instances, to pull out pieces of art that have something worthwhile in them and to try to engage with them in the culture in whatever like small way we can. You know, it's not like our conversations or the articles we write about it are having a huge impact. But if we can get anybody to look at them and see that we are going to have to, I believe, look in this kind of post-modern, post-Christian world, we're going to have to look to pre-modern things. And obviously, pre-modern Europe became that precursor to Christian Europe. A lot of those beliefs that those people held transitioned into the beliefs of Christendom that made it great. So those are the reasons I like to look, especially to something like Northman, The Green Knight, things like that. And the reason that other movies like Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, I don't see quite as valuable, even though in some ways maybe it's even a better movie to some people. I don't see it engaging with pre-modernism in the same way, in the same kind of serious fashion.
Oh no, the Last Duel, I love that movie, but it isn't.
Oh yeah,
it is an
think it's
act
great.
of pure modernistic contempt.
Correct.
Like well, if you've ever read the Eric Yeager book, the original book is about two different historical perspectives on an event that no one actually knows the truth about. And The Last Duel's answer to that question is, what if we just put a Me Too answer on it? Well, like, we'll answer the historical question by reading a modern answer onto this historical event, and that's the answer. Which
I like The Last Duel a lot, and there are a lot of good things about it, but it's completely a modern and pre-modern piece of work that does not take the medieval world seriously at all.
I wouldn't even call it pre-modern. I would just say it's just a straight up lie.
Yeah,
it is an act of historical revisionism.
Yeah, and I don't know that Ridley Scott was setting out specifically with those kind of malicious intents in mind at all. I think he was just trying to make a movie that would speak to today, although it obviously did not have the effect that he wanted it to. Plus, there's the fact that Rashomon already did basically everything that he's trying to do, but way better.
Well, yeah, I know it was written by Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, and then another woman who's a feminist. And apparently they all agreed what the actual content of their sections would be, and they just wrote their own segment. And you can tell because
I didn't know that.
It reads like three different people writing the same book, and it's
to good effect. I think I will admit that is to good effect. I think in the movie,
except for that last third. That last third just it obfuscates the whole thing. It just like this is the real truth. Like it literally when the title card comes up for that last segment, it says the truth, and it's the truth because it's the woman's perspective, which that's just like the most unserious feminist postmodern thing to do. It's like no one knows the true nature of truth except for the victims, and you know who the real victims are? Women. Clearly. Like I'm being smug, but that's what the movie says.
From the records that we do have, it seems like the actual woman character was pretty much believed. It seems like from what records we do have that she was pretty much believed and that the duel pretty much happened because they couldn't settle it otherwise.
Which I need to
read.
Seems
like that's the case.
I need to read the book. I'm told it's spectacular and it explains it all. But yeah, it's not a useful film for the kind of thing we're talking about in terms of like using postmodern art to create truth. This is postmodern art creating obfuscation. It's awesome obfuscation. I love it, but it's not useful in the realm we're talking about, where at least the Green Knight can point to a narrative and say, you're supposed to be walking this path. Why aren't you walking this path? At least the Northman can say, look at these virtues. What does it mean to live out these virtues? And The Last Duel doesn't do that, but it's still cool. It
has different purposes as well, and I did like it overall. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I think the value of the Green Knight has a lot to do with like you were saying, about the only thing I will say about it is the Green Knight is purposefully vague, I think, in its kind of conclusion. And the Northman, in the ways it is vague, has more to do with Robert Eggers not really being able to commit to a certain viewpoint necessarily. But both of them you could even call those issues. But yeah, otherwise, I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I at the same time though, I get why people are turned off by his movies. Like as the great director, the great director Robert Eggers said in a recent quote, another film where I wanted penises and I didn't get them. So I don't know what his fascination with having every one of his characters jerk off at least once a movie, but I don't blame a Christian who walks away and doesn't like the movie for that.
There is ugliness, and so there is a certain amount of ugliness that at least the Northman had less of. You did have more violence, and that's the same thing with the Green Knight too. There's a lot of ugliness that I think especially Christians are not going to want to have to endure. But one thing I will say is that I still, as I've kind of said throughout this, is I do think that we do have to encourage some of that, and certain amounts of ugliness do have to be confronted in order for us to find, especially for people who are not Christian, to find the paths that they need to walk and to find the truth. So I go back and forth on that.
Well, as a great man once said, all good stories are about love, death, sex, and money. So you have to, if you're not approaching at least one of those things with some level of honesty, you're not telling a story. But yeah, I mean, I guess both of us would both say go see the movie. Like, I don't think
definitely, yeah.
Neither one of us, we're both advocates for original film, and this month in particular has been very good, or April in particular has been exceptionally good for original films. So go see Everything Everywhere All the Time, and go see the Nick Cage movie. Go see Father Stew.
Is really good.
Go see RRR, the Indian movie, which is very, very good. If you get a chance to see that,
I haven't seen that.
Not a lot of people have, but I saw it. It's the best epic ever made about why the British Empire is bad.
Really? Okay.
Oh yeah, it's basically it's a movie about like the Indian independence movement, but it's about it's done in the style of like a Bollywood musical, so it's over the top, masculine, intense musical stuff, like all the things you expect from a Bollywood movie, but
interesting.
Yeah, definitely go see that. Go support original movies. Don't go see Doctor Strange 8 times. Take one of the tickets you're going to spend to see Doctor Strange in the next week and go see a movie that is actually original. I am sure Doctor Strange is good. I'm going to see it. I like Sam Raimi, but go support original films so that Robert Eggers isn't like sucking eggs in a sewer in the near future.
He'll be fine.
One can hope.
Yeah.
He's already had he basically canceled the Nosferatu, so you never know. But
yeah, I understand why he wants to make that, but I think it's already been done in a absolutely fantastically twice, and I think he should move on to other things.
Well, you never know. I mean,
the original and Werner Herzog's are both fantastic. So
we're going to be getting a Barbie girl movie later this year from the woman who gave us the amazing Little Woman adaptation.
Oh,
so.
You
never know what one of these great artists can bring to a story that shouldn't be told. So,
sure, I do love that. I think it was a GQ interview asked Eggers if he would ever make a movie set like in what they call the modern period, which is contemporary period, and he was like, "No thanks."
All right, you want to plug your stuff real quick and call it a night?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can follow me on Twitter at @heavymetalpin. And I'm also at my website, theflummox.com, and I have begun contributing to the Dispatch as well. So there are a lot of various things that I'm working on at the moment, but if you follow me at those places, you can keep up with them. I should hopefully later this year have a debut poetry collection coming out. So we'll see how that goes. I'll keep you updated on that.
There you go. This is Ethan McGuire, and I'm sure we'll have him on again when we have another film we argue violently about. So good to see you again.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Have a good night. The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions and cultural review podcast. Editing, hosting, and producing are by Tyler Hummel, art by Crystal Cali, and original music is composed by Guap Squad Gang and Melissa Lafira. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below and tell us anyone you think would be a good guest for the show. Thank you for listening.